Chapter 19. Chapter 17. Eliza didn't leave her room the next day. She told the Malfoys she felt a bit under the weather, and they reluctantly left her alone. She could tell that none of them believed her. In the years Draco had known her, Eliza didn't think she's ever been ill before at all, but thankfully they didn't question it. Eliza's not even lying that much. She did feel a bit sick. She didn't touch the diadem. She doesn't even pick it up from the floor where she had thrown it. Instead, she focused on pulling herself together. She jumped in the shower and pretended not to notice how long she spent trying to drown herself beneath the rushing water. She wrote a letter to Tom. She didn't tell him about what she had discovered. He would find that out himself when he absorbed the Horcrux, and then she sent both the diadem and the letter off with Hedwig. It wouldn't do to keep Tom waiting, especially when he would more than likely have to track down the Horcruxes prior to the diadem before absorbing it. She was a Horcrux. She carried a piece of Tom's soul, but she was also Eliza Potter. Nothing could take that away from her. She wasn't Tom Riddle possessing the body of poor Eliza Potter, who had never gotten a chance to live. This wasn't like Pansy Parkinson or Ginevra Weasley. If anything, she and Tom were just soul mates in a way. It reminded her of the old Greek legends, how when humans were first made, they were made as a double. They had 4 arms and 4 legs, and when the guards became too scared of their power, they split them apart, and they became individual people, searching for the other part of their soul. We are unfashioned creatures, but half made up, someone had once said. A Muggle author Eliza had read over her stays at the orphanage. She was fine. It was all fine. And it was, really, after she spent the day considering it. Eliza had allowed herself her moment of crisis, but the more she thought on it, the more she once again felt more comfortable in her own body. After all, she could freely admit, at least to herself, that she loved her friends. Love, something Tom Riddle had never managed to achieve. It was hopelessly sad that that was the thing that reassured her. It seemed Eliza Potter and Tom Riddle had always been inevitable in some form or another. She didn't know why it was such a comforting thought. Next day she left her room and joined the Malfoys for breakfast, as if nothing had happened. Draco stared at her as she delicately cut into her omelette, but he didn't say anything on the matter, and soon they were back to playing Quidditch. It was funny how, when everything suddenly shifted, nothing ever seemed to actually change. On Yule night, Eliza was invited to join the Malfoys in the family room. A Yule log crackled merrily in the fire pit, and Narcissa told Eliza to light one of the candles herself. When she did, Eliza felt a wave of peace crash over her. The Malfoy family magic was heavy in the room. It reminded her of the manor itself in some ways, crystallized and opulent, and somehow incredibly comforting. Eliza had thought she had a family in her court, and she did, but she had never before experienced the parental comfort that came from Narcissa braiding her hair, or Lucius actually having bought a present for Eliza despite their disagreements. She had sold a vial of Jormy's venom to be able to pay for her gifts to the Malfoys and her court. She had bought a rather expensive bottle of scotch for Lucius. She had heard him complaining about Professor Snape drinking all his best liquor the night of the ball. She had struggled on what to get Narcissa for quite a while. She couldn't think of one thing to get the woman. In the end, she had enlisted Draco's help, and after paying for a rather expensive leather-bound album etched with the Black and Malfoy family crests, she had filled it with photos. Photos of Narcissa and Lucius from before and during their Hogwarts years. Eliza had sent letters out to distant family members and had received a wealth of photos that were lost over the years. Eliza had even sent a letter to Professor Snape, who had almost gleefully provided her with wizard photos of Lucius and Narcissa at Hogwarts. Pranks and dates that had been forgotten, lost in memory to time. Eliza had even found some photos of their wedding, of Draco's birth, although the blonde had been furious to find Eliza with his baby pictures. The album was filled to the brim with photos of all the things Narcissa had shared with her over the weeks, and Eliza found herself anxiously awaiting Narcissa's reaction. The woman had come to mean a lot to Eliza over these short weeks. Oh, Eliza, Narcissa breathed as she flipped through all the pages, pointing out many things to Lucius, who also looked suspiciously overwhelmed. Narcissa didn't waste another moment, and Eliza soon found herself being pulled into a giant hug by the Malfoy woman. "Thank you, sweetheart. I love it." Eliza tentatively hugged Narcissa back and smiled when she was hugged tighter. Draco broke the emotional atmosphere by chortling over a picture of Lucius trying to climb the Whomping Willow on a dare, and they spent the rest of the evening laughing and trading presents as the Yule log burned. Later that night, Lucius and Narcissa pulled her into their office and present her with a dainty silver bracelet. A Malfoy bows to no one was engraved on its underside, and Eliza slipped it onto her wrist with a vow to never take it off. Lucius revealed that it was a portkey to the manor, and if Eliza ever needed to escape danger, she could activate it by saying, "Tauger's pure," the Black family motto. Eliza didn't cry, but it was a near thing. Later, she and Draco also exchanged gifts. Eliza gifted Draco a ring with a small dragon curled up on it. She experimented with runes for weeks to make sure it would make the wearer impermeable for near 10 minutes when activated. She had spent the past 3 weeks pouring her own magic into it to make sure it was the strongest shield that could be produced. Draco, in turn, had given her a set of magical lock picks with a knowing glance and a teasing grin. To my sister, Eliza, yours, Draco. Eliza read the note and froze, reading the words again and again. Draco was looking at her anxiously, worrying his lip in an uncharacteristic show of nervousness. Eliza threw herself at the boy, tackling him into a hug, holding him tightly. Because Daphne had become her friend, had tried her best to provide that friendship, that sisterly bond Eliza had always lacked. Blaze had given her true friendship. He had given her the sensation of touch, of an arm flung over her shoulder to let her know that she was loved. Theo had given her unconditional acceptance. He was a steady, constant presence, a listening ear and comforting advice. Draco had given her, for the first time in her life, family, and she was more than happy to accept. The rest of the holidays passed far too quickly after that, and she split all her time between the Malfoys evenly. She spent time with Narcissa in the sunroom, spent time with Lucius in his office, debating politics and sharing stories about Uncle Save. She couldn't wait to say that to the man's face, and although she was angry at Tom, she wasn't about to ignore him on his birthday. Eliza sent him some dragon hide boots with a silencing charm inlaid into the sole. She had also sent him a traveling cloak that Eliza had painstakingly embroidered in runes for warmth, silence, and protection. Tom hadn't sent her anything for Yule, but Eliza hadn't expected him to. He had refused to take any money off her, so she couldn't even imagine what he was doing to get by. Eventually, she and Draco had to return to Hogwarts, and Eliza could honestly say she was sad to leave. Narcissa had made Eliza promise to write to them weekly, and even Lucius had extended the offer that Eliza was welcome to return over Easter break. Eliza would probably remain at the castle over Easter break, but she appreciated the gesture nonetheless. She spent the train ride catching up with her court, laughing heartily as the Hogwarts Express rushed forward through the countryside, bringing them all closer and closer to Hogwarts, closer to home. Although now perhaps it was no longer the only home she had. Because of the way the term-landed students didn't even get a weekend to settle back into Hogwarts. Eliza was thankful for her time Turner. When her past self was attending potions, Eliza met up with Roman to check on her Slytherins, as he had stayed behind over Yule with his brother, Professor Selwyn. Finding everything in order, Eliza went to visit Jormy in the chamber as lunch took place in the Great Hall. Eliza had managed to get a rabbit from the house elves in the kitchen, and as Jormy ate his lunch, Eliza snacked on hers. Jormy was missing Tom, and Eliza wished she could do something to make the basilisk better. Instead, she resolved to give him a few more rabbits for being such a good boy. The rest of the week passed in a similar fashion. Eliza became accustomed to her ridiculous time travel timetable again, offered to beat up some Ravenclaws who had been picking on her second-year Slytherins, did her homework, and relaxed with her court. She'd die of boredom over summer with nothing to do. She just knew it. That didn't mean she didn't abuse her time Turner privileges, usually for naps. At this rate, Eliza worked out she would be turning 14 in May instead of July. It was lucky she was one of the youngest in the year. No one was likely to notice time catching up with her. It was Thursday today, and after reminding Lupin about his promise on Patronus lessons, she was now making her way to his office after dinner. "Evening, Professor," Eliza chirped, letting the door swing shut behind her. "Happy Yule." "Not particularly," Lupin said dryly, and Eliza snorted. "Ah, yes, the whole werewolf thing." Right, Lupin said, immediately launching into the lesson. Did you do the reading on the charm? Eliza nodded in response and began to rattle off everything she knew about the Patronus charm, the pronunciation, the wand movement, and how each was unique to the wizard casting it. Excellent, Lupin said happily, clapping his hands together. Now to cast the Patronus you must fuel the charm with a happy memory. Dementors feed on hope, happiness, and the desire to survive. The Patronus embodies all of that, and as the Dementor cannot feed on it, it will retreat, the professor explained, and Eliza listened on curiously. Lupin's explanation was fascinating. After all, if a Patronus demanded a happy memory to fuel it, to sacrifice then, by most definitions, it was actually a dark spell. Eliza couldn't imagine having that much trouble with it. Of course, we don't have an actual Dementor to practice with, but I'm sure you can learn to cast the spell without, Lupin said, and then hoisted himself up so he was sat on top of the desk at the side of the classroom. Take some time to find a happy memory before casting the spell, and please don't be surprised if nothing happens. Many adult witches can't cast it at all, he told her, and Eliza nodded in determination, searching her memories. She immediately discarded anything from her life before Hogwarts. She wouldn't be finding any happiness there. Eventually, she decided on the moment she received her Hogwarts letter, when she finally knew magic was real. Taking a deep, steadying breath, Eliza held her vine wood wand out in front of her and cast, focusing on the memory. Something whooshed out of her wand, a blurry, silvery mist before it quickly dissolved. "Well done, Eliza," Lupin exclaimed, probably intentionally ignoring the blatant disappointment on her face. "Now try that memory again." Eliza did, clinging onto the moment as she cast the spell again, only this time it produced even less, and Eliza stared down her wand in disappointment. "What memory did you use, if you don't mind me asking?" Lupin said curiously. "I thought about when I first got my Hogwarts letter," Eliza confided, and stared questioningly at the professor as he let out a soft acknowledgement of understanding. "The moment you knew magic was real," Eliza nodded. "It may have been enough to beat your boggart, but a Dementor preys on a different feeling than fear. You need a stronger memory," Lupin instructed, and Eliza felt herself balk. Magic was who she was. She didn't know what she would be without it. Out of everything in her life, her magic was what made Eliza so undeniably Eliza, especially considering recent events. If the thought of her very own magic was not happy enough to fuel her Patronus, then what hope did she truly have of casting it? Perhaps seeing her despondent face, Lupin told her they would leave the lesson there for the day, as it was her first time learning the charm. Eliza left the kind professor's office feeling downtrodden. There was nothing she hated more than failure. The rest of January passed by in a similar manner. She tried and failed at Patronus lessons after trying to find a happy memory. She spent most of her time with her court and her Slytherins. She had found out that Gemma wished to go and work in the Department of Mysteries when she left, and that Roman, as his brother was clearly not interested in politics, would be taking over the family seat in the Wisengamot. She had not heard from Tom. She couldn't tell if that was a good thing yet, or a bad one. Other than that, she did what every other Hogwarts student did, and attended lessons. Muggle studies and divination were still ridiculously easy, and history of magic she studied by herself. She doubted Binns would notice if she didn't even turn up. Defense was interesting, although not particularly trying, and she had essentially turned Transfiguration and Charms into self-study classes. She was already close to sixth-year content in both of those classes, when you had practiced with wandless magic, for as long as she did some branches of magic, was simply easier to handle. She would do the same in potions and herbology if they weren't so damnably hands-on. Magical theory and arithmancy overlapped more than one would think, which also eased the burden of how many classes she was taking. It was in those classes she was somewhat thankful for her Muggle upbringing. From the way the purebloods sometimes looked, it looked like algebra had single-handedly slaughtered their dreams. It took her until early February to realize what a moron she was. She was sat with her court in the common room, and as usual they had taken over the coffee table by the fireplace. The surface was half covered by Eliza's essays alone, which thankfully hadn't taken too long to write. She had used a dictaquill to write her Muggle Studies essays, How Muggles Use Electricity, and had started on her rune translations at the same time. She had always been able to multitask, but it was this particular skill that made her court look at her like she was a monster more than any other. She had finished her essays when Blaze had waltzed into the common room from Hecate Knows, where, but judging by the satisfied grin on his face, she truly didn't want to know. The boy had flung himself dramatically across the sofa and plunked his head right on Eliza's lap, throwing his legs over Theo's much to the boy's disgust. Theo didn't kick Blaze off the sofa, though, simply placed his book on top of the boy's legs and carried on reading from there. Draco and Daphne were sat on the floor by the coffee table, arguing over what color to paint Daphne's nails and when will you finally let me paint yours, Draco, when Eliza finally realized. Of course, her Hogwarts letter wasn't going to be her happy memory. Hogwarts was her home, of course, but what was a home without a family? She walked into Professor Lupin's office that week feeling remarkably cheery, something the professor himself obviously took note of. "Found your happy memory, Eliza?" he asked with a proud smile on his face. "As if anything could stop me for long, Professor." Lupin smiled again at that, and then they ran through some basic breathing exercises to center Eliza's core before Lupin told her she was ready to cast. It was a highly advanced spell, and as such Eliza needed a close connection to her core which she couldn't get without concentrating. And then she focused on her court. She focused on Theo, the first real friend she ever had. She focused on his steady presence, calm and still in a way the others weren't. He's her right hand, a listening ear and a fierce protector. She pretended she never noticed the healing potions stashed in her trunk before she returned to the orphanage, turned a blind eye to the many in-house disputes he resolved when she had too much on her plate. But she knew, and she loved him for it. Blaze was different. Theo was steady, but Blaze was flight and mischief. He taught Eliza that touch could be a good thing, with every ruffle of her hair, with a comforting arm over her shoulder. And with every bad pickup line and horrendous pun, he taught her how to have fun, something she didn't have a lot of experience with. If Theo was always there to pick up the pieces, then Blaze ensured she didn't break in the first place. She thought of Daphne, a girl as headstrong as Eliza with ambition in her veins. Daphne had been a friend to Eliza, she had been a sister, and the closest she had ever gotten to a mother before Narcissa came along. Daphne was fun like Blaze and steady like Theo, albeit a lot more overtly. But sometimes Eliza didn't want Slytherin's subterfuge. Sometimes she needed to hear that she was loved and that her court was there. Daphne was that reminder. And then she thought of Draco. Smart, dramatic, witty Draco. Draco, who in many ways should be her opposite, who instead she had found a kinship in. Draco, who didn't yet recognize his worth. Draco, who was still growing like they all were. Draco, who handled her sharp edges, handled her raw truth, and instead of pushing her away, instead pulled her into a family. "Expecto Patronum," she said strongly, steadily, the images of her court held in her mind. And then, out of her wand burst her patroness. It's as tall as Lupin. It pounced around the room with wicked sharp talons and ruffling feathers, and clacked its beak at the professor as it pranced past. It looked, faintly, like Buckbeak. "A hippogriff," Lupin breathed, and then burst into sharp, shocked laughter. Eliza attempted to pet her non-corporeal guardian and watched it dissipate into silvery mist. "A hippogriff is an exceedingly rare patroness," Lupin began to explain, snapping off a piece of Honeydukes chocolate and handing it to her. "Hippogriffs are prideful creatures," he stated, leveling a knowing look at Eliza before continuing, "so those with a hippogriff patroness are usually self-assured and proud, intelligent and cunning. They don't forgive insults easily, nor do they trust easily. But once they find those that earn their loyalty, nothing can stop them from protecting those that they claim are their own. Hippogriffs also represent fierceness and danger as well as a lust for freedom. This patroness often means you command respect and often lash out at those you consider beneath you." That being said, Lupin paused, considering her carefully. "What makes a hippogriff patroness so rare is that it can only be conjured by someone with a huge heart and a large capacity to care." Eliza couldn't contain her snort. "Well, something obviously went wrong on that account, Professor. Did it?" Lupin asked, with an intense stare that made Eliza felt like she could be seen right through. It wasn't legilimency. It was just the deeply unsettling sensation that she was known. "You care for your court, yes, but they are mine. And you care for every student in Slytherin House. You told me what being queen entails. I know what you do. I know you care for creatures. I even know you're fighting for creature rights. I may not have been at that ball, but Severus certainly was, and he was more than happy to complain about you. Eliza didn't even have time to unpack that statement before he was off again. I know you have convinced yourself you're only aiming high because you crave power, but I know that isn't the case, Eliza. I know you crave power because deep down you care, Eliza. You care so much. Eliza didn't know what to say to that, but she knew she was unsettled enough to want to change the subject. It was odd finding people who seemed to believe in her so much. Shall we practice again? Lupin obviously noted her deflection, but instead of calling her out on it, he smiled instead and ruffled her hair. Of course we can, kid. So Eliza went back to practicing. Each time she cast the charm, the movement became quicker and quicker, until eventually she didn't even have to run her breathing exercises beforehand. And if she thought of another boy right before she cast the charm, a tall boy with molten eyes and a sharp smile, then nobody needed to know that but her. She made a note to finally write a letter to Tom. She wondered how he was doing. Tom sullenly poked the sandwich in front of him. He didn't even know why he had bought it. All he had wanted was a bottle of overpriced water, but then the damned cashier wouldn't stop talking about meal deals and offers, and if Tom didn't want to murder someone right there then, he would take the sandwich. Because sometimes, a voice said, even though murder was definitely a solution, it was probably never the solution. And that voice sounded almost definitely like Eliza. It's not like he was really paying for it anyway. Eliza wasn't the only one who had kept up with her wandless magic over the years. A confundus charm here, a compulsion there, and Tom could breeze through most Muggle establishments without much bother. Airports, however, were hell. Not only were there cameras monitoring your every move, there had been nothing like that in his day, but there were just so many Muggles. Families and rowdy teenagers, screaming children, and elderly couples who thought they were entitled to his table at this fast food place. He didn't even want to be here, but by now it was more pettiness than anything. Stacking his empty boxes on top of one another, Tom took great pleasure in creating a fortress made out of empty cartons and coffee stirrers. If he had to suffer waiting for the plane, then so did everyone else. This would be so much easier if he could apparate from country to country. No, instead, he was forced to confound and imperious his way through a bloody, twice-damned Muggle airport. The crowds were unbearable. The security checkpoints made him want to strangle anyone who dared come near him, and then these Muggles think he's going to give up the only seat near his plane's gate because they glared at him. Tom would kill them with the plastic tray in front of him. He knew he could do it. The first thing he was going to do in England was get some fake papers together. At least that way he could use portkeys without being noticed. Portkeys never used to be regulated, but Tom knew they were now, and he also knew anyone portkeying into the country illegally would be on the Aura's radar, something he was trying desperately to avoid. Thus the plane. Initially he had planned to stay in London over Yule, but he quickly grew bored waiting on Eliza to send the Horcrux. Instead he had travelled to Japan, well known for meditation that would hopefully improve his occlumency. Reabsorbing Horcruxes was trying on the soul, yes, but the bombardment of memories, and not quite his own emotions, definitely took a toll on his mind. Thankfully, his 2-week study did in fact improve his occlumency once you got past all the spiritual guidance bull. It didn't help quell Tom's more homicidal urges, but it did help him reason, an ability his counterpart had obviously lost his hold on. When he received the diadem and the gifts off Eliza, and he certainly never expected that, it was, well, nice. He had planned to do the ritual in Japan until he decided to have a discussion with the diadem. It was a very odd sensation, arguing with a figment of yourself. Tom knew he had no one else to blame but himself for being such a snarly prick, but by Hecate, it really put things into perspective. No wonder Eliza sometimes looked at him as though he had a second head. Tom could even run rings around his bloody self. He made a note to turn down the blatant smarminess he seemed to carry. It was a wonder Eliza hadn't smacked him, yet without an older fragment of his soul to temper out his teenage arrogance. But the diadem did have a point. The diadem had been made by Voldemort in the 50s, and as such held most of his counterparts' memories. To absorb them all at once. Tom dreaded to think about the effects. It was best he reabsorbed his Horcruxes in order to avoid damaging his mind, lest he become the insane shell of a man Voldemort had. And so back to London he travelled, to acquire Hufflepuff's cup. Although, standing in a queue a mile long as he waited to board a giant metal bird that flew thousands of feet above the ground, where he had to trust in Muggle competency and physics to avoid dying in the middle of the ocean, made him regret his choice. He might prefer being unhinged if it meant never being on a plane ever again. After telling the hostess for the 10th time that no, he did not want any of that watered-down swill they actually tried to sell as coffee, he was finally left alone. He was shoved in the window seat, and the man who had taken the seat next to him was already asleep. Being this close to someone, to a Muggle, made Tom bristle, but he would cope. And if the Muggle didn't stop snoring, then Tom would take his revenge when they landed at Heathrow. One quick Avada Kedavra, and all of Tom's pent-up aggression would be released. A perfect plan, although Eliza probably wouldn't appreciate senseless killing. Tom retreated behind his occlumency barriers to drown out the Muggles snoring for one, but also to do something a lot more important. Plan. Eliza had told him he had broken into Gringotts once. He was sure he could do it again. That thought alone got him through the rest of the hateful flight. When Eliza entered the great hall in the morning, her court were already seated. By now they had stopped trying to make sense of Eliza's frankly ridiculous schedule and didn't wait up for her. They still always sat around her spot at the table, though. Things weren't perfect, but Eliza could admit ever since she cast her patroness things were at least good. She still had moments where the cold would wash over her, where she would freeze as her constant litany of "Who am I?" crossed her mind. But now she pulled herself together quicker and easier each time. She was Eliza Potter, and people had to bow to her before anything else. One identity crisis and a soul piece wouldn't stop her for long. Sliding into her seat, Eliza began filling up her plate with a slice of toast to avoid Daphne's lecture, and paused when Blaze threw the copy of today's Daily Prophet in front of her. Gringotts Burgala strikes again, the headline read, the goblins saying that an important artifact had been stolen from the Lestrange vault, but they would eventually catch the perpetrator. Eliza knew they wouldn't. Smirking, Eliza duplicated the front page of the paper and immediately started writing a letter to Tom to ask him about his current travels. "Was this your beau?" Daphne asked, watching, as Eliza furiously scribbled out a letter before her next class started. "Don't call him that," Eliza said, but they all knew it was a token protest. The nickname had caught on, and they would all make it stick. Maybe not Thea, although she couldn't tell if that was because he feared her or the Dark Lord more. But it probably was, Eliza replied, and smiled softly when her caught snort in response. Surprisingly, it didn't take too long for Tom to get back to her, which obviously meant he must be staying in the country for the time being. "Dear little star," the letter read, "it's shocking what happened at Gringotts, wasn't it? They really should be investing in better security if it's that easy for someone to sneak past. I was actually in Gringotts the day of the break-in, sorting out some papers. Mighty strain. Thank you for sending the diadem over to me. I'm currently keeping it safe before we can be reunited. I believe something quite bad may happen if I begin messing with the order of creation, or reabsorption in this case, and so yes, I decided to turn my gaze onto the last 2 heirlooms I need to recover. Well, one now. It is a pain like no other, little star, the ritual I use, but I believe it is worth it to recompense for my sins, so to speak. Did you know that after I left Hogwarts, I spent most of my time working as a clerk in Borgin and Burke's? Eliza did know that, in fact, because the diadem had told her. Evidently, he had not informed Tom about their midnight chats. I don't think you could quite believe, little star, how much useless knowledge I have about dark artifacts rattling around this brain of my mind. Although they do let me drown out more unpleasant memories. What possessed me to let old Hepzibah Smith lay her paws on me, I'll never know. Still, I think I got more satisfaction out of her than she did out of me for a person from the 40s. Tom lacked rather a lot of decorum. Eliza refused to be embarrassed on most things out of principle. But the things Tom spoke about, or at least implied, could even make her blush. She wondered why he was so Muggle London. In the 40s. Come to think of it, Eliza would bet that Tom didn't even use his real accent. The thought of Tom using Cockney slang was enough to make her laugh. The fact that Professor Snape immediately looked wary at his spot on the teacher's table upon hearing the sound simply made her laugh harder. Once my memories settle, I will of course begin hunting for my next family heirloom, which will hopefully be in England. Though I know I love to travel, have traveled in some ways I would much prefer to do so whole, or as whole as I can get. No direct reference about her, which meant either Tom wanted to ignore the topic like she did, or the diadem hadn't told Tom what truth he revealed to her that night. Either way, it was enough to stir her anger, just a bit. But that's enough about me. You, however, darling, are just full of surprises, aren't you? A full corporeal patroness at 13, and one as rare as a hippogriff. I knew you were extraordinary, darling, and this just proves it. I don't think I have or ever have been able to produce a corporeal patroness. I don't know whether it was because of my meddling or simply because such things are even beyond me. Such things of happiness, such things as love. Eliza wished more than anything that she could change that. How are your classes, little star? Your court. If I can't murder muggles, then the least you can do is stay out of trouble. Yours, Tom. P.S. Give Jormungand. Stop calling him Jormy. He is a basilisk for Merlin's sake. My regards. And to be fair to Tom, she did try and stay out of trouble. It's just that trouble had the damnedest ways of not only finding her, but inviting itself over for tea. Like Sirius Black once again, breaking into Hogwarts.